Muted.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second online meeting of the Rapid Rehousing for Youth Learning Community. We're so glad to have you all here today, especially given the technical difficulties that we had on the original scheduled date for this webinar. To minimize background noise, all lines will be muted except for speakers, and throughout the webinar, you can post your questions for speakers and provider panelists in the box on the right of your screen. And our agenda for today is we'll just briefly introductions of our speakers and panelists, go over the goals of this community, and then do an overview of the first core component of rapid rehousing, which is housing identification. We'll also have a presentation from a provider about this first core component of rapid rehousing for youth and housing identification. Then we'll have, as we did last time, a provider Q&A, and we're really happy to have several experienced rapid rehousing for youth providers joining us. We'll also do a review of the responses that you all gave to the first assignment, and then cover the planning for our next webinar. As you know, today's webinar will be focused on the first core component of rapid rehousing, which is housing identification. We're really excited to have so many great youth rapid rehousing providers joining us, including Beth Betzer-Rice from Salvation Army of Central Ohio, Jody Jackson from Heartland Family Service in Omaha, Nebraska, John Lawler from The Connection in Middletown, Connecticut, Julie Bach from Pathfinders in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Kathy Tillotson from Build Future in Huntington Beach, California, Kippy Clausen from Shiloh House in Littleton, Colorado, and Robin Meyer from Northwest Youth Services in Bellingham, Washington. And we're really proud to also have the Alliance's own Kay Mosher-McDivitt join us from our capacity building team. So to get us started, just a quick reminder of why we're all here. We want to improve our knowledge and understanding of rapid rehousing for youth by learning from one another about effective, programmatic, and systemic responses in communities that use the model. And this is even more important now because so many communities have recently been awarded a lot more funding for youth rapid rehousing. The most recent COC awards were a big win for young people, and I know we all want to make sure that we provide the best rapid rehousing response that we can for these youth. So since this increase in capacity is such an exciting call to action, let's go ahead and get started. We'll kick off today's learning with a presentation from Kay Mosher-McDivitt from the Alliance's capacity building team. Kay is a national rapid rehousing expert, and she was actually a provider at a program in Lancaster, PA that was one of the early pioneers of rapid rehousing, even before it was called rapid rehousing. So Kay, thanks for joining us today, and I was hoping you could get us started by telling us a little bit about yourself and your own program's journey to becoming a rapid rehousing provider. And then, of course, you'll move into a deeper exploration of the core component of housing identification.
Okay, thanks, Mindy. So as Mindy said, I'm working for our centers, the Alliance's Center for Capacity Building. And if you don't know a lot, what we do in the Center for Capacity Building is that we build on the policy team, the research team, and we take what we know and we go out into communities to really build capacity around best practice and around interventions that can end homelessness. And I think then the other thing that happens when we do that is that we bring that information back. So I'm going to tell you that out of all the trainings I do, like rapid rehousing is probably my most favorite thing. And I think it's because and Mindy asked me to say this, and I said again I could talk for the next hour, but I'm not going to do that because the really important speakers are coming out. But I first got involved in this and back in the early mid-90s, I took on and was the executive director of a transitional housing program for women with children. And I didn't have a lot of work. I'd done a lot of social service work, but not a lot of homelessness until I entered that facility. I think the really important thing, I think a lot of you as youth providers know, that when it comes to moms and kids, I had formerly ran a teen pregnancy program. Most of my history up until that point had been really working with pregnant and parenting teens throughout our community, and just preparing them for the changes in their life. And when I got to the facility, the transitional housing, I realized very quickly that there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the women that I was working with there and the teens that I had been working with, because for many of these, even if I was working with women in their 40s and 50s, a lot of them had actually been teen parents or had some kind of crisis in their teens and had sort of gotten stuck in that adolescent phase. And so I realized very quickly that the longer these young women and the older women stayed in my facility, it seemed like the less successful they were moving out, which seems to be that big shift against everything we always believed, that we get everything ready and then we ready people for housing. But I noticed that when the women would first come in, there was sort of this real focus on what they had to do, and they were sort of relieved that they were no longer out in the streets or in really in an emergency shelter. And so it was sort of like, okay, I'm going to do what I need to do. But then as time went by, they just sort of lost their motivation and they couldn't stay focused, and the housing piece just slid off. So very quickly, I made a shift, and this was before anybody talked about this, but I determined that we were going to be short-term. We'd still call ourselves transitional housing, but we were going to exit folks within 3 months. And what I realized, though, is that I didn't really have the expertise or the capacity to do that, so I started working with an organization in our community that was a housing counseling agency, and one of the things they were doing was, helping people find housing. And so the Shelter to Independent Living program, which is exactly what it says, people that are living in shelter are going to move to independent living, was a program that they had just started, and I was so fascinated by the program that I actually ended up running that program after a couple years at the transitional housing facility when I saw the work that they were able to do. And from what I learned is how quickly this is about rapid. There's a reason why it's now called rapid rehousing. That rapid word is the most important word. And what we've learned and what I've learned and why I love this is that, it's about the minute somebody becomes homeless, the very first thing we need to be talking about is that rapid exit to permanent housing, and making it happen very quickly. And without specific interventions, it just doesn't happen. So, so then I ran the Shelter to Independent Living program while I was vice president at that organization, but we really ran that, and we just learned so much from doing that, and it wasn't called rapid rehousing back in the 90s, but we kept saying we were rapidly rehousing people. And I think a couple key things that we learned, and I'm going to move right into this then, is that number one, that landlord relationship was one of the primary things we used to always talk about, that we didn't just have our clients that were the persons getting our services. We said our landlords were as much of a client as the people that we were providing the services to, and that we were equal partners. We were on the same team, and that landlord partnership was just as equally as important. And one of the things you'll be talking about soon is the third thing you see on the slide, and that's that rapid rehousing case management services. That it wasn't just about the rapid rehousing, right, but it was about what you did after people were in their housing. So all the stuff that we thought we had to do to get people ready for housing, we realized is much more effective when people are in their housing. So even at the transitional living facility that I was running, Tabor was getting the folks housed, but then we did very little case management within the transitional housing program. The bulk of our case management happened after people went into housing. So just a little. So can you see my enthusiasm? And I've already taken up like 5 minutes yakking about that. So let me just move into the little bit that I'm going to talk about to set the stage for this housing identification. So, I said before, rapid rehousing is this intervention, and it's really was designed to help individuals and families quickly exit homelessness and return to housing in the community, and we're talking permanent housing. And then ultimately, we don't want folks to become homeless again in the near term, so that's where all of those core components come in. And so there's the 3 core components. I don't know, some of you are very familiar with rapid rehousing and probably know this stuff, very readily, but others may be just learning to know about rapid rehousing. And so, within a program, there's 3 core components that without them, working together, you really can't do rapid rehousing. And their housing identification, the rent and move-in assistance, was the financial piece, and the rapid rehousing case management and services. And I will say that those core components were developed in collaboration with, and they were also endorsed then by USICH, United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. We tend to like to use a lot of acronyms, and I know all of us do. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD, and then the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA. And the reason that was so important is that we wanted to make sure we were all talking the same language. You know, and so now as youth programs are beginning to do rapid rehousing, we want to make sure that all of this is integrated so that rapid rehousing should, you know, feel very much the same. You know, each rapid rehousing plan is individualized for the needs of that particular client, but in terms of what we do in the core components is going to be incredibly important moving forward. So we also have now, in addition to the core components, which you can find on our website, we also then have published standards. And so how best practice programs can meet those standards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some standards for the housing identification, and then I'm really going to talk a little bit about how you can integrate those into programs when you are locating housing for youth, and then you're going to hear the on-the-ground work from the other providers that are on. So next slide. If you haven't seen this particular slide, you know, we're really familiar with it. This is an infographic that we put together that describes what these three components are about. So housing identification, what we're going to talk about today is this first one, finding housing. And, you know, people will sometimes say, you know, so exactly what is rapid rehousing? And I went to the dictionary and pulled out the definition. And what does the word rapid mean? It means, you know, doing something very quickly. And then what is rehousing? It means finding people, you know, getting people rehoused, finding housing. So that's really what it is. So it's not just about finding housing, it's about the quickness, the rapidness that comes with rapid rehousing. And then the pay for housing is the second component of the rental assistance, and then the stay in housing is the case management component. Next slide. So when we talk about this housing identification, that's what we're going to talk about, and it's really about that goal of finding housing for program participants very quickly. And I'm going to say that this recruitment of housing and landlords is essential if you're going to have rapid access to permanent housing from the moment they enter the program. Remember I talked about that when I talked about what I did and about the necessity of having this to be very quick and rapid. The more partnerships you have with landlords, the more partnerships your program develops, the more opportunities your participants are going to have to rapidly obtain permanent housing. And then what you're going to find as landlords benefit or experience the benefits of the program and working with you, you're going to find what we find from programs that are around for a long time. In the program I ran in Lancaster, by the time I left, there were over 300 partnering landlords, of which a majority of them, the minute they would have a unit available, they would call Tabor and say, we've got a unit. Do you have a family for us? Do you have an individual for us, depending on what the unit was? And I think you're going to hear from Beth later about the ways that that's worked for them around youth. So you're going to find that, you know, not only is it critical to get started, it's going to be the, you know, that ongoing core of your program moving forward. So, you know, one of the things is you're going to have to look at like landlord screening concessions, because a lot of your participants, you know, with youth particularly, they may not have any rental history, they may have limited income, they may not have the references that landlords look for. So you're going to be really working to get landlords to look at give you some concessions to what they normally do. And what we learned in the program I ran and what we're learning across the nation is that landlords are often willing to waive a lot of those requirements because they're going to have you as program staff communicating with them and working with the tenants to resolve problems, and that's something they don't get when they rent to people that may look better on paper, but they don't have you and your program. So it's sell, sell, sell. I also think it's not just about landlord recruitment. So you could have a ton of landlords, but you may not have the right match for the folks that you're working with. So you need to have appropriate housing, the housing that they're going to be successful in, and that means having housing in different neighborhoods, having different types of housing, shared housing options, because what is permanent housing for all of us looks very, very different. And specific to youth, it's going to be really important to find landlords that may have a heart for youth. I have that in my notes here in quotes. just, sort of have a passion, So when you think about this, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is when you think about where you're going to find your landlords is, start with people you know, and people that you're working with, because it's amazing how all of us have some connection to landlords. They may be private landlords, they may be property managers. We all know somebody, and getting started there is important. So you're really going to need a variety of options, because each of the youth you work with, they're going to be all different. They're going to have different needs, and you're going to need a good fit between your youth that you're working with and the landlord. That's going to go a really long way. So next slide. So we're going to dig a little deeper into the core component standards. Next slide. So there's 3 principles with housing identification within the standards. So here's the 3. So the first one is that within the limits of the programs or the participant's income, rapid rehousing program should help the household access units that are desirable and sustainable. So in red, we have, access units that are desirable and sustainable. So that's really important. But back up to what I said in the, the first part of it, is that within the limits of the participant's income. What we found in the early days of HPRP is a lot of folks were just, there was all this money to be spent. HPRP was Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program that came out of the American Recovery Act. And for those of you that may not be familiar in it, it was implemented in the fall of 2009 and ran through it was a 3-year program, ran through the end of 2012. And what we learned is that a lot of times there was all this money, so it was like, oh, well, we're just going to quickly get housing for people, and people were being placed in housing that they would never have the income capacity to sustain that housing. And so, specifically if you're working with youth, and when they do get a job, they may be only making minimum wage. I have a grandson who is so excited because he now has a job that in Pennsylvania minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. But he's getting $10.15 an hour. Well, he thinks he is just like the richest guy on earth. But we just talked about that this morning, and I said, but here's the thing, Cam, even if you were working full time, you'd probably need to get a roommate in order to really make it work for you within what rent costs in our community. So those are the kinds of things you need to be thinking about. And then the second bullet is that housing identification efforts should be designed to and implemented to actively recruit and retain landlords. So, it's not just about, finding, being able to access a unit. The way you're going to do that is that you're going to have housing identification efforts, and you're going to have to be very focused on finding landlords. And that's something for most of us, we don't know what that's like, and we don't know how to do that because that's not what we are. Most of us are social workers, have social service backgrounds or clinical backgrounds, and housing identification is not something we do. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to think about that as you get into that in a few minutes. Go ahead. Next slide. There we go. So then the last one is remembering, I have by saying this, that the landlord is a vital partner, and you need to really be responsive to the landlord's needs as well to preserve and develop the partnership. And so you give equal, you give them equal access to you, just like you do the youth that you're serving in your program. That's just going to be incredibly important. And, as I mentioned earlier, landlords are also going to be willing to make concessions when working with other programs. So successful programs just really know how important that landlord relationship is. So what does this mean now in talking about these 3 standards? Housing identification is not just this little side thing that you sort of add on to rapid rehousing program. I think that in many ways it's the first and most important element as you get started. Before you can even start thinking of housing folks, if you're one of those programs that recently got funding, you got to start the landlord piece right away, because without that landlord piece, you're not going to be able to do rapid rehousing. Next slide. So under the housing identification standards, then there's some more kinds of things on what I already talked about some of the standards, but when it goes into a little bit detail, I'm going to cover 2 of these things that I think are really the most critical to talk about. So the first one is this program staffing, and I'm going to talk about how you're going to put this in practice before we hear from your provider that's doing that firsthand. I think it's going to be really important to really think about who does this. I already mentioned that a lot of us are not, finding landlords, talking to landlords, understanding landlords, talking the business model is not something that we're doing. So having the right person to do this job is going to be incredibly important. So this is not just, as I said before, standard social worker or case manager position. This person really needs to understand what's important to landlords, be able to communicate on that business model, and then really be able to market or sell the program. So sometimes somebody with a business or landlord real estate background or a marketing background does really well at this type of job. So specific to housing youth, we all know that as a young person, we probably did not make the best tenant in our rentals. I mean, I look back and I feel really bad for the first landlord that ever rented to me. So beyond, landlord recruitment, you also need to match your individuals to the appropriate housing for which they're going to be able to pay for afterwards. So I think, again, specific for youth, and I said this before, really talking to your landlords, networking with folks that already work with youth might really happen. So just really thinking about that is going to go a really long way. Next slide. And then I want to talk also about H4, which is your program policies. So this really talks about how you meet that principle. So, I talked about the principles. There's a bunch of standards, but I'm not going to go over all of them. So this is the other standard that I'm going to talk about. And it's just going to be really important to be responsive to the landlord's needs. So when you look at your policies, you should really talk about like a basic level of support to landlords who lease a program participant. And we're not talking the money here. We're talking about, the role of staffing. So, what's the basic kind of thing? Some programs will say, we're going to do a check-in with the landlord once a month, or, you need to sort of figure out what you think is going to really work and what your landlords are going to need. And then, after that, you do a case-by-case. So you should have a basic standard. And some programs do a quarterly check-in with landlords, and they tell them that up front, that every quarter, we're going to be checking in with you to just see, if things are going well, if you're getting the amount of rent that the tenant's supposed to pay, in addition to the amount we're doing, if you're hearing, of getting any calls or reports of problems. But then you can also say, but you can call us in between if there's a problem. Like you can add on some other things. So make sure that you really do that. And then we've got A, B, and C here. And these are the things that are important. Respond quickly. So if a landlord does call you with an issue, we recommend that you would respond within a business day. It should talk about how you're going to seek to resolve any conflicts that come up and work on both sides. And this is, again, where you're partnering with both, so you need to be supportive of both partners in this relationship. And then whenever possible, if somebody is not working out or they, want to break their lease, and again, we find this happens more often with young people, although I say that, but I'm not sure that that's true. But I think a lot of, we just need to be prepared that, things change in young people's lives, right? And they tend to be very still sort of in the moment. And maybe, they reconnect with family or reconnect with a friend and want another living arrangement. If you find you're not going to be able to help your youth maintain that housing for the terms of the lease, then work with the landlord. Try to negotiate move-out terms. Maybe you have another youth that can move in right away. So really think about how you can do those things. Slide. So as I talk about housing identification anywhere we do, I talk about this, there's sort of what I think is 4 key factors in housing identification. So first of all, you need to have a plan for developing landlords. So you need to start planning now. If you're planning to run a rapid housing program and haven't done it yet, you need to start talking about this and come up with a plan now, and not wait on that. And then you want to have a clear understanding of what landlords are interested in. So when you engage them, you really can think about the incentives your program can offer them. You want to identify who on your staff is going to take this responsibility, and then you want to make sure that this housing search and landlord engagement is an ongoing process. So I'm going to talk, next slide, a little bit about developing the plan to recruit landlords. So I already talked about this, but it's just really important that you don't only want to increase the number of landlords you work with. You need to have I talk about just a plethora of options, different types of housing, different types of landlords, so that you can really make the right matches with those that you're working with. So, how do you get started? So the first thing you might want to do is have a staff meeting, and this is not just the staff that are working in the rapid rehousing, or if you, are in an agency that has a youth program and a multitude of other programs. I mean the entire staff. Everybody has ideas. So bring together the staff at a staff meeting and start really coming up with a master list of ways that you might be able to find landlords. And when you engage the entire organization, it's just really interesting in how you can really brainstorm who people know, where people can get started, and make it sort of an organizational strategy. And then I always say, once you start that list, keep it in your, if you have a staff kitchen or a staff lounge or someplace where your staff congregate, just keep that list there and just challenge people to keep adding that. Because if you depend just on the person that's doing this, it's a lot more work. But if you can get more people involved, it's going to really help. And then really start thinking about, what are some of those housing options. And so you sort of start with ways that we can recruit, places we can go, but then really think about ways that you can connect with landlords. So I always said to my staff is that every opportunity that you're out there talking to anybody, I don't care if you're having a drink, at happy hour, and start people what you do and tell them that you need landlords. It's amazing how you can start bringing up landlords from that. The other thing you might want to do is, find out, like maybe talk to people that are in your personal network or professional network and say, hey, like when you were younger, when you had your first apartment, like, what was a good landlord that you rented from? Who are landlords that you might know? And if there's a university or a technical school or something like that in your area where there, are students that need to get housing off campus, talk to that school. What landlords do they use? When you're working with youth, that's a great way to start really thinking about finding landlords. So I think, again, as you continue to build a good relationship among housing providers, then it's going to be word of mouth, and you're going to have more options. Next slide. If you've ever seen us, so I actually sort of talked about that in the plan. Yeah. I should have had that slide up the last time. I'm sorry. So now the next slide. So this is the slide that they just showed was the slide that sort of talked about the different ways to get started, and you'll have a copy of this later that you can look at. So I think now this one is this number 2 is know what landlords want, and then identify incentives you can offer. So first of all, put all of the balls up there. Actually, click, 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 click. There we go. So I'm going to start with the ball at the top. On-time rent. Obviously we know landlords want to receive their rent on time. And so one of the things to think about when recruiting landlords is how your program can help meet this goal for the tenants you're working with. Perhaps, you have youth that have never paid rent, and the landlord's going to be really worried about that. So if you're going to be working with youth on, budgeting and, setting up a bank account and finding ways, just think really creatively about ways that you can say to the landlord, we're going to be really working so that, that our client really has a good understanding and understands that, for instance, doing the first is doing the first and what that means and how to get it paid. Because a lot of times, if they're just running to any person, they don't even know what skills they have. This way, you can say this is what this person has, but you can also talk about what your program offers and making sure that happens on time. The second one is the one that's on your right, which is a long-term rental. Landlords like stability, and because it costs landlords a ton of money whenever they have to fill apartment again with advertising fees and just getting an apartment ready. And then there's also usually between renters there's a 3 to 4 month vacancy, and that's we heard that in talking to some real estate places that it costs landlord as much as $4,000 to turn over a unit. So, one of the things you can offer, first of all, you're going to be there to try to help your folks be long-term renters, because even after the financial assistance ends, you can still do case management. In fact, we encourage that. But in addition to that, if it doesn't work out, if your youth moves on, you've got a whole pool of people that can fill that unit. And so we've learned that that's a huge selling factor for programs, that, if somebody doesn't move, doesn't work out, move out, you've got somebody else that you can pair up and you can get that unit filled immediately and save that landlord a ton of money around that. The third one then is the being a good neighbor. So they don't want disruptive tenants like loud noises, a bunch of suspicious visitors. All of that's the kind of stuff that drives landlords crazy. So we also know that young people have a harder time sometimes setting boundaries with friends who just sort of want to hang out. So being a good neighbor is really this critical skill. So one of the things that you can do in your program as part of the case management, you'll hear another series is going to be that home-based, where you're going to actually, be visiting your person in the home, your client in the home, and be able to sort of see what's going on, if there's extra people living there. You're also going to be there to really help, through your case management, work with your youth to really help them set boundaries and understand how, having tons of friends around, that they may just think they're having a good time in the house, but if it's bothering people next door, that can be a problem. And just teaching some of those things, those life skills. We can teach all those life skills we want to before people find housing, but it doesn't matter until you're in your housing. Teaching that life skill once folks are in their housing is going to make a huge difference. And then the last one is property care. And so again, just really sell the stuff that you're doing in your program that's going to really look at that. Often landlords have to use their own personal accounts to cover any expenses, so, they get really worried about that, and, they want to sort of know, are they going to damage my apartment with their youthful antics? So really thinking about what your program can offer, which be one of the things you might want to do is have a contingency fund so that if there is some property damage, you'd have something to fall back on. And then, again, just really thinking about landlords that sort of really have an understanding, of what's going to happen with youth, and knowing that you're going to be really working with I keep on to say the kids that you work with. And so that's why you hear me keep going, because that word kids wants to come out, and I know that's just not a good term to talk about it. So when you're working with your clients or your youth, really be thinking about that. Okay, next slide. So then the third one is identify the staff that's responsible, and you see in the slide sort of what we really talk about. So I really talked about this earlier, but here's the thing. I think we are really recommending that staff should, that your program should really have staff that this is their primary responsibility, and the job description for somebody that does this should not look like a social work job description. In fact, having a social work degree is not an important thing. What they need to be is a good salesman and mediator. They should really have this understanding of landlord and tenancy issues, perhaps a background in housing, be very personable, have good negotiating skills, maybe a sales or realty background, and also really good people skills. So in essence, it's like this person needs to understand the 4 things I just talked about and really know how to sell a landlord on your program. And then finally, and then I'm going to be done. I went over my 20 minutes here. And then finally, it's the housing search and landlord engagement. It's being an ongoing process. So, number one, don't wait to recruit landlords until the person that needs housing is sitting in front of you. And I emphasized this before, and I just can't emphasize this enough, is that you need to get started like right away and be constantly building landlord relationships. We've heard about programs that say, well, I give a list of landlords and then tell them when they find their housing to come back. There's nothing rapid that's going to happen about that. And if the folks that we work with could find housing on their own and find landlords to rent with them on their own, they wouldn't need our program. So this is really changing that thought process and how you do that. And then also then have that list of landlord partners so that the minute somebody is in front of you ready to be rapidly housed, that you sort of get to know what it is they need, what they want, what they're looking for, what they can afford, and then you know what kind of landlord you can hook them up with. And again, I want to say at the end, as I finish up here, is don't forget about shared housing options, especially when you're working with youth. I think the thing that we've really learned is that shared housing is what most of us did when we had our first apartments that we didn't live on our own, and having roommates goes a long way in terms of not only making things more cost effective, but even just sort of having people to be there. And so really be thinking about that and working on that as an option. Last one. So I'm just going to end by saying creativity is key. Like, just identify any and all opportunities for housing. And here's my 3 key things. If you don't remember anything else I said, I also know I talk really fast. But be bold. Don't just ask for anything. Ask for reduced rents. Be really bold in who you ask, but also be realistic. Coming back to what people really can afford. and then lastly, and I say this not only for youth, for everyone, but I think particularly for the youth population, shared housing can be a really good solution, and we really need to talk and think about that when we're working particularly with our young folks. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mindy.
Thank you so much, Kay. I always learn so much from your presentations, even though, of course, I have access to so much rapid rehousing information here at the Alliance and on our website. So thank you. Next up, we have a great provider who's been doing youth rapid rehousing for many years now. Beth Fetzer-Rice from Salvation Army in Central Ohio is going to tell us all about her program, and particularly to delve a little deeper into the housing identification core component and how Salvation Army makes that core component work for young people in their program. So Beth, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, thanks for having me. Okay, well, thanks Kay for kicking off. A lot of what I have, I think, hopefully mirrors what you say, and I'll dive in a little bit deeper. First, just let me say that we have been doing rapid rehousing for quite a long time here in, my office is in Columbus, but we also have rapid rehousing programs in our suburban and rural communities. So we've been administering rapid rehousing since 1998, and again, started in the urban center here in Columbus, and then as other communities contingent to Franklin County started to kind of grapple with, we're starting to see, they don't want to say they have homeless problems, but they're starting to see people, maybe they're homeless. They started looking at, of course, alternatives to shelter because they didn't really want to build anything congregate. So they started asking us to come out and talk about our current model. At the time, it was called direct housing. And so we've just kind of expanded our rapid rehousing programs out into we have a Region 10, which is 4 counties. We do SSVF in 11 suburban and rural communities, and then we have a rapid rehousing program that covers our entire balance of state, which is 80 counties, and that's a little unique. But all that to say that when we closed down our shelter in '96 and made the move to rapid rehousing, it was a difficult transition. And we weren't sure as an organization it was the right way to go, but after many years, it really it is what we think is best for our clients. It's for the participants that we serve. It's what they want at the end of it. They want housing, and so this model has been great for our clients, but also great for the organization. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned. We closed our emergency shelter in '96, and I, of course, don't advocate for closing all shelters because they are much needed. But from about '98 to 2009, we focused primarily in our organization with serving homeless families. We were funded by numerous, HUD, Department of Development, but really had not started to serve transitional age youth at all. We had identified it as an emerging issue in one of our suburban communities of Columbus, and had met with Children's Services a few times to talk about emancipating youth who were coming out of their care, and how some of them had places to go back home with family, but many of them were going to be homeless without intervention. So we really started working with them to try to identify funding to do a small pilot project just to see if there was something we could do to help this population. And what we realized is that the models there at the time were transitional housing, which of course we didn't have any in our county or any surrounding county, and then kind of a more congregate facility where youth would have to leave their community and go and live somewhere else. And none of those, we didn't have the money for any of those, and we really didn't want to move kids out of county or youth out of county. So what we decided to do was take what we had been doing for a very long time, which was rapid rehousing for families, and look at adapting it for young people. And I think next slide here. So this was kind of where we started. We had we were targeting emancipating and homeless youth. We would do homeless prevention or rapid rehousing at the time, really focusing on that 18 to 22-year-old age group. We were sticking with our kind of philosophy of trying to make rapid rehousing fit for as many people as possible. So we're looking for households that have moderate to severe barriers, knowing that some didn't need our services, and then you had folks on the far end of the spectrum who really needed more of a permanent supportive housing, but that we really thought, you know, the good 60 to 80% of homeless youth would be able to be served by a rapid rehousing model, tweaked a little bit. We're committed to serving people rapidly. For us at the time, our Franklin County programs try to house within 14 days. It's a little longer out in the suburban and rural areas, but we still shoot for 14 days or less. We wanted to do the scattered site model that we had been doing for years. We don't own anything. We work all with scattered site landlords. We needed to tweak our financial package for this particular population. And at the time, we were just starting to kind of work with progressive engagement. And so what we say is we have a stair-step diminishing assistance model, but we do use progressive engagement to make sure that the youth, that it fits the needs that they have. We're assessing whether or not they need assistance every month. But on average, what it turns out to be is that the subsidy is deposit and about 4 months of full subsidy. And then we're working toward transitioning the youth to paying more of the rent on their own. And if they can contribute more, great, we ask them to do that. But it's 75%, 50%, and then 25%. We also have to help with utilities, a lot of startup fees. And then, of course, our goal is around housing stability. Also, we're trying to increase their skills, their independent living skills, those things. But the #1 goal for our youth is housing stability. Okay, next slide. We did finally find some money about 6 or 7 years ago to start a small pilot project. We were really shooting very small. We wanted to try to get the community to buy into this new model. They found it a little risky to take what they considered kids and put them into housing that weren't associated with a university or something like that. So we said, well, we'll serve about 5. We'll kind of have a case manager that we already have working. We'll just ask them to do a little bit more. They'll serve these 5 youth. We knew that we would have some additional support, additional financial assistance and social services, but really just thought we would just kind of add it on to our regular family programming. And in the first 6 months, we served 8, and we kind of had to shut the doors because we were going to be out of money really, really quickly. We got the United Way to buy into it at a local level, and we had some really good success. We had 8 of the 9 youth were able to, we were able to find a landlord to rent to them, and they were able to maintain their housing for 6 months or more, but none of them actually failed out of housing. They moved to either back to family and friends, or they moved to another unit because there's a lot of transition in this population. And then everyone was really working on their stability plan goals, and that had a lot of success as well. Next slide. What we found, though, in that first very intense year is that our idea of just kind of adding this transitional age program into our existing family program wasn't going to work for the long term. We found that the model to what we thought to do it correctly and to really provide the stability that these young people need is much more expensive than families. It's a much longer financial assistance commitment. We weren't really sure about our target population when we started, which led to some issues around youth being referred when they were still in care and still in school. Difficult for kids or youth to find jobs and maintain, employment that's eventually going to be able to lead to them being able to maintain an apartment when they're still in school. So we kind of had to make sure that we weren't taking youth into the program until they were either graduated or had a GED, but they were kind of past that that school age. We very, very much underestimated the amount of life skills that young people would come to our program with. And so that was a piece that I think we had to really quickly adapt to. It took far much time for case managers. They were spending whole days with youth as opposed to maybe a couple hours doing a housing search, just because they really came with no experience, a lot of them no employment experience, no rental experience, and we really had to start kind of at square one, and that takes a lot more time. And then I think the other thing is, as a family provider, we're used to a lot of success, but also, our fair share of families not making it. But with the youth, it just was a real roller coaster, and I kind of chuckle now because over the years I now have a teenage daughter, and it's very much like my teenage daughter. You have really great days, and then you have days where everything's going just fine, and then there's a big hiccup, and you have to regroup, refocus, spend a lot of time, and then you get them right back on track. But what we came out of with this first year is that we were committed to this population. It filled such a need in our community, and for the youth that we were able to work with our first year made such a difference for them. And you saw where they had kind of come into the program, their skill level and their ability, they really had nowhere else to go. Without us, we were really afraid of, kind of where they'd end up, maybe in a single shelter in one of the bigger cities or on the land. So we felt that us providing that safety net for them, like most teenagers or young people have in their life through college, we felt that that was a really big piece for our organization that we wanted to provide. Next slide. Okay, so how we adapted, and this has been over the course of a few years. It didn't all happen at once, but we added right away a more intensive life skills curriculum, and it's had a couple variations. But what we quickly found out is that young persons who are emancipating out of foster care have been through every program you could possibly imagine, and they weren't interested in any more programs. They didn't want to learn any more about budgeting or anything like that. So what we had to do is, we didn't hold groups or classes. We really increased, as Kay said, our home-based staffing pattern so that we were taking kind of this life skills curriculum, making it much more experiential and taking it out to the youth into the homes that we placed them in, the units that we placed them in. So we used to say we were a home-based model. Now with our young persons, we say that we're mobile case management staff because we meet our young people anywhere that they need to meet. That could be at McDonald's, Tim Hortons, at their friend's house, in our office if that works, but wherever they need us to be, that's where we meet them because there's just so much movement and so much kind of spontaneity about where they're going to be every day. And like I said, we make our life skills, it's self-directed, so nothing that's mandatory. Youth get to kind of choose what pieces of the curriculum they want to work on. And then we make it as practical and realistic as possible. So if it's budgeting, we talk about look at your budget and then we go to the grocery store. Or if it's employment, let's talk about, let's go out and look at your bus route or how you're going to get there. We're doing things to teach them practical skills, but then kind of making it hands-on. So they don't feel like they're in a classroom being talked to and taught all the time. With the youth population, we've always been a housing first organization since we first transitioned to rapid rehousing, but I think this has solidified our commitment to housing first. And with this population, you really have to kind of check yourself to make sure you are not putting up hoops, not requiring things that aren't necessary, really trying to meet people where they are and provide them the amount of services kind of, again, as Kay mentioned, with as little power differential as possible. The youth need to know that you're partners with them and that you're not trying to get them to do things that you want them to do and just trying to find a way to make that happen. We employ a lot of strengths-based practices. Definitely harm reduction is one that we practice. Again, we're trying to be a safety net, so we're allowing some attempts to, how I put this, we allow them to do things that maybe other programs might put them out for, but we are committed to being a safety net. So there are consequences sometimes for their actions, and we'll advise against certain things. I heard Kay mention having too many people in your unit, or having people stay over too much, or maybe getting a dog, or doing different things. We might talk to them about how that might negatively affect their relationship with their landlord. But at the end of the day, it is their self-determination, and they have to have some natural consequences. We stay with them through that, however, so that they have that safety net, and they learn a little bit, and then we move on, because just a bump in the road shouldn't mean they become homeless again. We definitely expanded our definition of success with this program. We are definitely a housing first, permanent housing focused organization, but for not all young people, that is the best solution for them. Sometimes it is a return to their family. Sometimes it is a doubled up situation that's planned, where they have a roommate situation. So definitely had to expand our definitions, and then also look at more incremental success. You know, some smaller steps that people, that our young people were working towards to stay stable. Those things are really important, and because it's such a roller coaster, we needed to find ways to show them that they were being successful in much smaller sections, or a much smaller time frame, because they needed some immediate success, some immediate, I don't know, praise, or kind of understanding that they did well, and that really has gone a long way. Along with those additional definitions of success, we really had to work with our funders at the state level and also at the local level to make sure they understood kind of that this wasn't just the regular, another, you know, rapid rehousing program for families or individuals, but that this was kind of a special population. It came with some different challenges. It was more costly, and most have been very, very supportive and understanding. In fact, it's one here for the local United Ways. It's one of the programs that's funded with the highest amount of allocation. So they really have bought into it, and they realize it's just a little bit different. And then lastly, we really had to increase our outreach with our landlord partners. And we have a pretty extensive landlord base since we've been doing this for so long. But we do work in small communities, urban and smaller communities, and sometimes you have just a few landlords who have a lot of units. So we had to really look at who we worked with, have some real discussion with them about this new population and some of the ups and downs they could expect, what they could expect from us as far as potentially increased funding, more intense services. And then we also had to go out and recruit additional landlords, because some of them just weren't willing to take a chance on this population. So we had to spend we already spent a good amount of time on our landlord engagement and retention, but we had to increase it for this population. Next slide, thank you. So the first thing we do with landlord engagement is really set before we ever meet a landlord, and it's really in-house with our staff, and that is that we have established what we call a culture of housing. We do that from the minute you step in as an intern, or if you're interviewing with us. We talk about housing first. We believe that everybody is ready for housing with the right supports. We talk about our expanded definition of success, and that we start planning for housing the very first time we meet somebody. And we need to we make sure that everybody agrees with that we don't have anyone who feels like they have to have mandatory services up front. If they do, they don't stay too long. But we set that tone from the beginning. We have a systematic approach to housing first, and so we integrate kind of the housing plan and the assessment of barriers and challenges into the front-end screening. We do if they have a housing timeline, employment timeline, we do that on the front end. We try to match that with a landlord that we have that we think will work and fit with them. Next slide, please. Some of the things that our case managers do when we're working with youth is that, especially those who've not rented before, we spend a lot of time prepping them for meetings with landlords. So we do a lot as an agency working with landlords on our own, but eventually the young person has to meet with the landlord. So we do a lot of coaching like you would in any kind of job readiness program. This is kind of landlord readiness. We talk about what they should wear, how to practice presenting yourself and your story. What are good things to say, maybe what is too much to give. How to handle tough questions. So we kind of do almost like a little mock interview with a landlord. How to handle those kind of awkward questions about things that maybe they have in their past. What to do if they ask a question that maybe is a surprise to them. How we might have some sort of a signal if something gets a little touchy that we might be able to intervene. We talk about the importance of a follow-up phone call or a visit, just like almost like you would with a job, but we just kind of prep them for that so that they realize, one, that it's really important how you present yourself to them, because this is a relationship you're going to have with the landlord for a year or more, hopefully, and that it's going to take work, and those apartments don't just kind of fall into your hands. It's going to take a little bit of work. So we go through those things so that they're not surprised or overwhelmed. Some of them definitely still are, but that they have an idea of what's going to come during that first meeting with the landlord. Next slide, please. Then we talk about, as far as our case managers, what they can do is we make sure they know what services we can offer to landlords. Provide all of our tenants, all of our clients with landlord and tenant education. We try to sign everyone up for some sort of housing subsidy, even though there are none out there available most of the time. That's something we can definitely do. We do transportation coaching. We write letters to landlords about the family's participation if needed, about the program. So there's a lot of things that we can kind of give to the clients that make landlords happy. Next slide, please. One of the things we talk with our case manager, kind of building on what Kay said, is that we first take a look, once we have kind of our young person in the door and we kind of know what their barriers are to housing, we look at our existing landlord base and we decide, do we have somebody we think that meets this kind of, it's a good fit, or do we need a new option? And as we're looking through our list and we're talking about new options, one of the things we do is we really rely on our staff's skill. And I know Kay mentioned that they're really moving toward having one position designated as a kind of a landlord engagement person. And we have tried that, and for us it works in our urban locations, but in our rural locations where we have a lot of area to cover, it's just not possible with the staffing pattern that we have. So all of our case managers, when we interview them, we're interviewing them to make sure they have good case management skills, social work skills, but that they're also what we call part social worker, part real estate agent. And we make sure, again, that they realize that there are two parts to this job, and both are equally important. So when we're looking at those landlords, we try to determine kind of quickly what is our strategy. Some landlords come to our program because they have a heart for working with persons in poverty, with the homeless. Some really see it just as a financial transaction in their bank account. We kind of look at it as how do we want to present this. At the end of the day, most landlords have a kind heart, but they also need to be paid. So we kind of set a strategy going in of how we're going to open the door to get in to have a conversation with the landlord about our young person. One of the things we also will do is if it's a landlord who's existing, we can build on our past successes, even if it's a young person, they're not quite sure about taking on this population. We can talk about the successes we've had with our other families, how they've had success working with the agency, all those things that Kay mentioned around making sure their rent is paid on time, they know we're in the home visiting, and a lot of times that will be the key to opening up the door for your young person to get into a unit. Next slide, please. We also, at that time, we start to think about if we have a landlord we think kind of fits with our particular use. We start developing our funding strategy, and all of our case managers know how much money they kind of have to work with, and they know the parameters that they're able to kind of move within. And we jokingly call it the wheel and deal stage, but sometimes because this is what landlords often will see as a more risky population, they will require more on the front end and to get someone into a unit. And we don't like to give a lot of money up front. We usually like to do just a deposit and first month's rent. We don't promise anything past that. But we regularly kind of make deals with landlords. So it could be anything. It could be first and last month's rent. Sometimes we do double deposits. We will do letters of guarantee from the agency if it's a Friday afternoon and there's no way we're going to get a check cut from our finance department, but maybe they'll let our young person move in on Saturday if they know the rent's coming. We'll do that so that we can quickly move them out of wherever they are. We will master lease as a last resort. I can say we've not had to do that in the last several years. And then we also can really tailor the service component. We have some minimum standards, as Kay mentioned, as far as the number of times you should be seeing people and checking in with a landlord. But depending on kind of the risk the landlord feels they're taking, we can bump that service component up. We can make it more intense. We can do written things, all with the consent of the client. But we really can tailor those services. We can ramp those up if we need to for a landlord who's feeling a little iffy about taking on one of our young people. And next slide. For us, landlords are seen as really, really valuable pieces to the program. We could not be successful, and our young people would not be successful if we didn't have landlords. And we never have enough, and we're always working hard to recruit new ones, but we're spending just as much time retaining the relationships that we have. Some of the ways that we kind of, I would say, maintain our landlord relationships is that we are always looking for ways to acknowledge their contributions with their consent. We have done little spotlights in the newspaper. We will put landlords, a landlord of the week or the month, in our newsletters. We write them thank you letters. Sometimes our families write them thank you letters. We make sure we acknowledge landlords in our other kind of funder meetings and other public and private meetings that we go to, because a lot of them sometimes are interspersed throughout the crowd. And like Kay said, in small communities especially, people know each other, and they'll be able to say, oh, I was at this event and we heard how great, of a landlord you are for this particular organization, and they really like that. We hold a breakfast once a year, and we have focus groups a couple times throughout the year where we actively kind of recruit landlords to come to. We invite them to those so that we can publicly acknowledge them. It's a little bit of a recruitment effort to bring a friend landlord who wants to come, and then we feed them because everybody loves that. And just as another opportunity for us to thank them. And then I guess the other kind of intangible thing we do is that we say we go the extra mile when we do our kind of presentation to the landlords, but at the end of the day, you really have to be willing to do that. So in addition to making sure that the rent's paid on time and that we're doing case management, when things start to, if there's a time when things start to go awry, maybe a youth damages something in the unit or they leave the unit a mess, we will put on jeans and t-shirts, and we will go in and we will try to help the landlord clean that unit, flip that unit. We don't have to do it all the time, but we have done it just so that they can see that we really, that this is like kind of an unusual case, but we're willing to help any way we can. We've had some really, over the years, and this is in our family program too, some situations that were just awful. People who had some serious mental illness, and just in a week or so, the unit had gotten just really in bad shape. We've pulled up carpet. We've offered to pay for repairs before, as Kay mentioned, with a contingency fund, and we talked to our local funders about using their money as flexible funds for those types of things. And we've saved a lot of landlord relationships just by going in and rolling up our sleeves and kind of doing some work, because letting them know how important their unit is to us. And then we also make sure that they know if our youth doesn't make it, and that we're very honest that some will not be successful, that we have a whole lot of other clients. We have youth, we have singles, we have families, but that we can quickly fill their space again so that they don't lose money having to re-rent it, repaint it, those types of things. So that usually is enough to kind of keep us kind of having good relationships with our landlords and a good number of units. Sorry about that. Go ahead to the next one. We find that marketing the program is really important. We're always, like I said, trying to recruit new landlords. We don't have a super fancy brochure or anything, but we do have something that we've made up. We make sure we have it everywhere with us. We have it at meetings. We get landlords, because we've been operating for so long, we have landlords actually who call us and ask to be part of the program. That's not the case in every community, but in many. And a lot of it is word of mouth. Landlords know each other in small communities. They know which organizations kind of deliver on their word and which ones that they might not want to work with. So we just try to make sure that we always have our marketing materials around so that we can make sure we kind of give them our information. So if they want to call us, or we follow up with them. We know kind of what landlords typically want, and we know their concerns. And as Kay had that one slide that talked about kind of things they want, some landlords will be willing to work with you on with families or youth that maybe have a few more barriers, maybe have records, criminal records, and some will not. So we really need to make sure that we seek to diversify and have as many options for people as possible. Sometimes that's not possible depending on what the barrier is, but we really work hard to do that. We know which landlords, we seek landlords who will take maybe one eviction. We have a few landlords that we would try to recruit that will take lots of evictions. We have one or two that will take people with felonies with certain safeguards in place. So in our marketing materials, we always make sure that we let them know that our program is not a one-size-fits-all, and that we'll work with them to craft something that's kind of right for them. So that's kind of crafting our selling points accordingly, making sure that we're kind of presenting the best space we can, trying to find out pretty quickly what the landlord's motivation is and what they need to work with us. And again, just knowing your audience, and that takes a little time sometimes to develop a relationship, but kind of know what they want and try to make sure. Sometimes we feel bad that we're just kind of, trying to give them what they want, but at the end of the day, the more landlords you have, the quicker you can get people into housing. Next slide, please. Okay. These are just some ways, again, that we find new landlords. We do cold calls, we do community searches, we use internet listings, Craigslist. I mean, some people still use, we have some landlords in small communities who still use newspapers and yellow pages. We have real estate offices. Sometimes they do both homes and they do rentals. A lot of word of mouth and a lot of clients kind of going out and hitting the pavement. For us, it's teamwork, so they might find the house first, or we might find it first, but we're all out there looking together. And again, we also will target owners who have a history of philanthropy. So we look for landlords who are on our board. We look at the board lists of other organizations who we also know have units. So really, anywhere that we can possibly think of to do outreach to landlords, we're always it's always in the back of our head to kind of make sure we talk about how that's a huge piece of our program and we need additional landlords. I guess the lessons learned for us kind of in our, our first few years and really ongoing is that our Rapid Rehousing for Youth program really grew out of just necessity, and it's not perfect. We have some young persons who need a lot longer time, and we need some crisis services on the front end. But for what we had at the time, the amount of money we had, we were able to implement it really rather quickly. We were able to kind of use the base model that we had for Rapid Rehousing and tweak it and utilize our existing scattered site landlords. So we really got it up and running rather quickly. It is not perfect, but again, we're trying to alter it. Again, we have the core components, but there are some special things that we do for this population. It is much better alternative to having to move people out of county into adult emergency shelters or the streets. So for us, it was the right decision to make. It is a good fit for many of our youth, but we still always advocate for continuum services. Right now, we just created a few PSH beds and units for our transitional age youth. So if we find someone who has some severe and persistent mental illness or another disabling condition, we're able to look at PSH as an option. And then we're also trying to build some front-end services for crisis. So, you know, the rapid rehousing is great and it serves many, and we will always put people in rapid rehousing and try to house them and to keep them stable if we don't have these other things. But we think continuum services is really necessary. And then I can't say enough how important it is to, and I know we all know this and it's easier said than done, but just diversify and get as much flexible funding as possible. Our youth program is funded with state and some HUD funds, but the things that help fill the gaps are the local community foundation funding and the United Way funding. So if we have just things that are a little out of the ordinary that the government monies won't cover because it's ineligible, we can really stay true to that kind of progressive engagement and tailor services specifically to the unique needs of our young people with that flexible funding and the funding that can really fill those gaps. And then we just always say, again, it's not perfect and we're learning every day, so we're just continually kind of evolving our rapid rehousing programming, keeping those core components, but trying to make sure we're meeting the unique needs of our youth, always trying to seek out new partnerships that would support them, that we have those services that they can take part in if they need to, and just trying to build that piece of it so that we have options for people when they need it. And I think that might be it. Yep, that's it. That's my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Beth. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. And I know you guys have been doing this for a long time, and it's been, like you said, a continual learning process. And it's always so exciting to hear about your programs. So we'll go ahead and ask the other panelists to join in. I'm going to try to unmute everybody. Are you? Jen's working on that. Thank you, Jen. And we didn't have as much time for this webinar as we did for the last one because of the technological difficulties. So I think what we're going to do, I want to do the Ask a Provider Q&A. We may not be able to get to the responses to the first assignment today, but we will make those available to the group as a document. Also, the summary of those will be available on this presentation, and the recording will, of course, be available to everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started with the Ask a Provider Q&A. And Beth, I want to start with you. One of the questions that we had from a lot of the attendees was about outcomes in youth rapid rehousing. So are you able to, do you have the data about outcomes for your program currently? I know you had for the pilot, the initial pilot that you did.
Yes, I would say we just actually looked at those because I just ran an APR recently. We are at about between 80 and 85% of our young people staying permanently housed for a year.
Great. And let's see, we'll go ahead and maybe just go down the list of those of you who are on the provider Q&A panel. Jody, Jackson, do you guys have outcomes for your young people?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull them up real quick. I know I'm not looking at them in front of me. I think 2015, we're usually at about 85 to 90% exits to PH, and then we follow them a year after exit, and that's been around like 89%.
Great. Thank you. Julie Bach, how about you guys at Pathfinders?
Oh, I'm looking at my outcomes as you ask. We have, I know, it's like, oh my gosh. We have 4 main outcomes for our Q-Block program, which is our longest established program. And that focuses on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning and allied youth. And so 85 for the year 2015, 85% of our youth maintained their housing. And they honored the terms of their rental agreement, which is always a big deal. 82% of them obtained jobs, 53 enrolled in some type of school, and 65 shared significant life milestones with their mentors. And one of the important components of our Q-Block program is that not only do we do the housing component, but we sort of do a mashup with a big brother, big sister. And that's to try to with Q-Block, obviously much of the time our young people are thrown out of their houses, and so they don't have a natural support system. So that last outcome is we're trying to recreate that.
Great, thank you. And let's see, do we have Robin from Northwest Youth Services?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey.
So
you guys?
Yeah, I don't have our most recent outcomes right in front of me, but I know in the past when I've looked them up, I believe for 2015 we're at kind of between 80 and 85%. And I'm just looking also, sometimes we pair a mental health service program with our rapid rehousing program, and for that it actually bumps the numbers up to between the 90 and 100%. I think right now we're at 100% there. So just, I think Beth mentioned making sure the right services are paired with the youth that need them. And so what we're finding is specifically when there's mental health services attached to housing, the stabilization rate goes way up. And we see a lot of youth that move out of maybe the apartment back with family or friends, kind of along with that. There's a lot of transition in that age range that's fairly natural. But yeah, that 80 to 85 is pretty typical for us as well.
That's great. And for those of you who don't know, Northwest Youth Services in their Rapid Rehousing for Youth program serve chronically homeless youth. So I imagine that mental health piece is really, really important for those young people.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And again, because we're short on time, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of try to get to some of the questions that were asked most often. One of the questions, and I think I probably know there will be a variety of responses here from you guys. There were lots of questions about shared housing. And so if each talk about like what your experiences have been with roommates. I know for some youth it seems like it's not, it doesn't work really well. I know for other programs it's seen as kind of an opportunity to have a real life experience. So maybe if we can just go down the list again and talk about your experiences thus far in your program with roommates and shared housing. Beth, we'll start again with you.
Sure. It's interesting. Over the years, we have tried some shared housing. We've tried it several times, and I would say most of the time it doesn't work out real well. We've tried to improve kind of our matching for you, especially when we were struggling finding affordable housing, any kind of housing that's possibly sustainable for the young people. Roommate situations makes a lot of sense. So we're trying to match them the best we can. We're also working on, we think it's important to do roommate agreements so that they kind of, on the front end, have an idea of what they'll be responsible for, and that helps a little bit setting some of those guidelines and parameters ahead of time. And then what we found is that, and this is a dynamic I didn't really expect, but that the youth that are emancipating out of foster care, we've had more trouble with shared living experiences with that kind of subgroup, and so they really want to live on their own and independently. And then youth who come to us who have been homeless for a while, maybe have been in foster care at some point, maybe are a little bit older, have had a little bit of time out of their system or their house. They kind of come back to us from a different source. Maybe they've been, sometimes they're camping with a group. that kind of subset of our youth population actually has done pretty well in shared housing. So we're trying to figure out if it's that little bit of time that they've had to go out and be on their own and they realize how difficult it is. We're not really sure. We're trying to dive into that, but we've had more success with shared housing from youth that have been kind of outside that system and are a little bit older than ones coming right out of foster care.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you, Beth. How about John Waller? Are you still with us on the panel?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Situations?
Yes, we have done roommates situations in the past. We don't do it in any type of forced manner where we pair them up. It's really up to them. But we proactively put some motions in place where we have a lot of social events as part of our program, so our clients get to meet and greet and hopefully pair up over time. And when we do find individuals that do want to move in together, we make sure that they have things like different case managers. Definitely prep the case manager because they're going to feel like a marriage therapist a lot of the time. And really look to try to support them in that relationship because we have very similar experiences. Individuals who have aged out of foster care have probably the most difficulty or resistance towards the idea of having a roommate. And a lot of it just tends to be, needs a lot of role modeling and learning process in order how to manage those relationships because it is a pretty age-appropriate housing situation. And at least in Connecticut, it's a financial necessity to do it a lot of times with our price market here.
Right, and you guys probably heard me say in the first webinar that we did, it's also an age-appropriate situation for people in their 40s, including me. How about Kathy Tillotson from Build Future out in Huntington, California? I know you guys have a really, really tight rental market there. So what's your experience been so far with roommate situations? Do we have Kathy?
Yeah, no, sounds like I've gotten lost.
Okay, we might have lost Kathy. Let's see, Kippy Clausen, are you still with us?
I sure am.
What do you got roommate situations?
So I'll take it from two veins. So the largest housing model that I was part of was our partnership with Division of Housing at the state, United Way, and the Coalition for the Homeless. And so we had 150 vouchers that were part of that. The dilemma with that is actually because of the type of voucher and guidelines, youth couldn't have roommates. So we did a lot of community events and tried our very best to create multiple young people in the same housing property so that they could actually create those types of relationships. So that was one strategy. The other project that we're really active in right now is our rural collaborative. And when we talk rural, some of our communities have 400 people in the community, and we're trying to get young people housed. So a couple of the strategies we're using there is a hybrid of a host home or a boarding house model, and actually we found that that worked really well, and almost using some strategies around a housing model where each young person rents a room. They come up with house rules, shared cooking. So it's a hybrid of a kind of a co-housing model that we found actually has been working pretty successful. Within that, then we have community mentors that come in once a week and cook a meal or do something with the young people to get them stable, and it seems to have helped alleviate some of those roommate stuff. On my end, the kids aging out of foster care, many of them wanted to have roommates, and they weren't necessarily roommates, so we rule where housing is not a dating opportunity, which really was an interesting conversation to start doing that. And we actually, all of our young people had to go through healthy relationship education classes as part of our housing curriculum that really talked about appropriate boundaries. And that was one of our good neighbor strategies too. And that, although wasn't a solution, seemed to change how we were having disagreements with roommates.
Great, thank you. And let me go down to, there were lots and lots of questions, and more than we'll be able to get to in the short time that we have left, about innovations and landlord engagement. So I thought I'd just, maybe a couple of you, if you can talk about off the cuff, kind of like one of your best stories about recruiting landlords, or something innovative that happened with landlord recruitment and connection that you think folks in the community might be able to learn from. And Robin, how about you guys at Northwest Youth Services? Some really cool landlord engagement story.
Yeah, let me think of one. You know, we actually just this week have connected with 2 new landlords. Something we've been struggling with lately is finding landlords that will work with youth who have felonies. And so we've been reaching out to our restorative justice organizations in the community, or reentry organizations, just figuring out, how to do that. And one of our case managers, so at our organization, the case managers are acting as the landlord liaison also, so kind of that double duty position. And we had one of our newest case managers just reach out to a landlord that had previously said, no, I'm not interested, it's too much of a risk, that kind of thing. And I don't know if it was just that she hadn't kind of been through the denial process yet, that she just boldly reached out and said, hey, I think you should do this. I want you to meet this client. The client went and, just introduced themselves, also was willing to take a risk. And the client, just without any prompting from the case manager, also then sent a follow-up text message to the landlord saying, hey, it was really nice to meet you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And the landlord said yes. So I think just it was a great learning moment for me too as a supervisor, just to say, even if somebody said no, it's still worth asking and coming back to it at a later time, and not being afraid to kind of take that risk, and acknowledging that the youth is taking a risk too when they go and introduce themselves. Because they've experienced that probably many times, people saying no to them. So that was kind of a fun and encouraging experience we had this week.
Awesome. Thank you, Robin.
Kippy, can I throw in one that
Sure.
We found really exciting? So being at the United Way, when I oversaw that house, the largest housing project I oversaw, we actually had one of the largest landlords in Aurora in Colorado who was on our board, and so we created a really great partnership with him. He was the largest property owner in that city, but within that we created this really great partnership where we actually had young people who worked in the leasing office and were actually the allies and kind of did a youth peer support model with him, and did a lot of the going in and problem solving, and that really changed his opinion. We've had now landlords that have stepped up and want that. We're actually one of our consumers who is living on that property in those larger units actually works in the leasing office and deals right on the spot. They're highly trained, but it actually really changed the landlord's opinion because he had somebody who could talk to that young person right away from their perspective and do it from a peer model. And that seemed to be really, really successful and help landlords feel like they had someone immediately there they could work with.
Oh, that's really, really cool. Thank you. Again, sorry, you guys, we are short on time today, so I'm going to go ahead and close things down. You'll see here that we were able to pull together responses to the first assignment, which was challenges that are facing the program or the COC in implementing youth rapid rehousing. And then we had lots of great ideas for overcoming those challenges. Some of which, especially things like housing first and landlord engagement, are things that we've already mentioned here today on the webinar. So this will all be available. The slides will be available as slides, and then the recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll post everything in the Facebook group. And I'd love to get a thread started on the Facebook group where you guys can just post all of your ideas about landlord engagement. So we'll do that as well. So next assignment, this one is actually going to be a quick turnaround because of the technological difficulties that we had on the first one. So by July 12th, if you guys can go ahead and give us your responses to this assignment. So for providers in the learning community, can you tell us about how you work with your COC on youth homelessness, and what are the biggest challenges in doing that work, and how have you overcome them? And for the local systems administrator folks, how are youth homelessness efforts being planned through your COC? What have been the biggest challenges for you as a systems administrator in improving the systemic response to youth homelessness, and how are you and your community overcoming them? That's the next assignment, and the next online meeting will be July 14th. And we'll have a little bit longer again for this one, 2 to 4 p.m. And this one will focus on the second core component, which is the financial assistance for rent and move-in, and how that core component is best adapted for young people. And again, the presentation will include a youth provider who is doing rapid rehousing for youth, and we'll also hope to have an additional rapid rehousing expert that can just talk about the second core component generally, and then of course have a discussion with providers overall about how this core component works for young people. And of course, as always, if you have any questions or comments in the meantime before our next online meeting, contact me, Mindy Mitchell, or Jen Saunders. And for those of you who are participants in the learning community, please join the Facebook group and connect with others so that we can share our ideas and tools. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for being a part of the Rapid Rehousing for Youth learning community. We look forward to seeing you at the next online meeting.